Joining me now is Chief Investment Officer Tom Caddick. Tom, let's talk markets. Obviously, we've had so many warnings of volatility in the markets, and we've seen a lot of volatility. How are things looking right now?
I think Madhushri summed it up beautifully there. We're cautiously optimistic on the markets. There has been a lot of noise, which is another way of saying volatility, of course. There's been a lot of noise, but actually they're behaving reasonably well. We've got, global markets. If we take a 30,000-foot look at things, markets are at near-term highs. The global economy looks reasonably robust and is supportive of that. If you start to narrow it down into some of the sectors, yes, we've had a lot of noise, and I'm sure we'll talk about that shortly. But broadly speaking, okay.
All right, so that's quite reassuring. Let's move on to Trump, obviously not unconnected to this issue. Obviously, once people got their heads around the fact he was coming back to the White House, what has the market reaction been like?
Well, we spoke at a client event just going into the election, and our core message from an investment standpoint was politics doesn't matter when it comes to the markets. The economy does, but it does create noise, and the noise has been fairly deafening since Trump took over.
Yeah.
And in fact, even in the build-up to, pre-inauguration. So there's been a lot of noise. We've seen a lot of market volatility as markets, particularly at a sector level, start to try to, I think, adjust to some of the policies or some of the decisions that have been made, at times unexpectedly so. So it's created a lot of noise, but actually we're seeing that all feed through again. We're seeing that actually it's the economy that really matters.
And of course, Trump likes to, tell us all that he's the ultimate deal maker, that he's going to, change the, as you quite rightly said, politics doesn't matter, but the economy does matter. But, rather like this government, he's putting all his chips on the economy and on growth and on jobs. But he's also upsetting a lot of people with his talk about tariffs. How unnerving is that? Or do you think that there is more bark than bite?
I would err to the latter, but tariffs. Some of the concern there with tariffs is that it does change geopolitical trade and global trade generally. We've already seen this with Mexico. We've seen it to a certain extent with Canada, where some pretty punchy tariffs get thrown on the table, short deadline, and then moved at the last minute. But it does have an impact. And there is also concern that tariffs are ultimately inflationary.
Yes.
So that has changed some of the perceptions of the amount of room that central banks have got to reduce rates if we're starting to see some inflationary impulses coming through.
I think it's been fascinating this week that we are seeing quite a lot of people murmuring about the possibility of a US-UK trade deal, whether or not it's worth the paper it's written on, whether or not it includes, agriculture and so on. All that's very early days. But that level of sort of optimism creeping into the general chit-chat this week, I've personally found very interesting. And the thought of a Starmer-Trump trade deal, sort of hilarious.
Who would have thought
Who'd have
that?
thunk it?
Yeah, exactly. It's particularly in the build-up to the election, and with some of the comments that have come through from, say, the likes of Musk, who's busy whispering in the ear of the president. So, yes, we're seeing a lot of change. Clearly at the same time, there's talks coming out of the US and the Trump administration of imposing tariffs on the EU. So that would be a very interesting thing to see. But I think you don't want to put too much emphasis on the rhetoric. We have to actually see the action and how that plays out. I
want to talk about UK specifically in just a minute. We just talked about Starmer. I want to talk about Rachel Reeves in just a minute. But before we move on from America, talked about Trump and, of course, the visions of all the tech bros lining up, behind him, really getting in bed with Trump. That's been pretty surprising in the last few months. What sort of market impact is that having?
I don't think particularly dramatic. Clearly there is a bump in terms of, say, Musk-affiliated companies, the likes of Tesla and the like. I think it's just people trying to reposition for a new administration. And if ever there was someone being sensible, probably, and if ever there was somebody in charge who would respond to that, you would probably argue it is a Trump character.
And talking of tech, obviously we've seen a lot of issues around AI. We saw the Nvidia share price absolutely tank. It did come back a bit. What's the implication of that? Is that something we should all be holding our breath about, the threat of sort of Chinese AI and so on?
I think it's more about the likes of Nvidia trading at the sort of multiples they were trading at. So the sort of valuations that they were on as a stock, it's almost pricing in perfection.
Yeah.
So, those high growth rates are going to continue going forward. And you get to the point where the market expects them to continue to beat expectations. And they had been doing that. And now you have a situation where there is a external threat of a cheaper methodology, a cheaper route through, that maybe doesn't rely on those sort of super grade chips that Nvidia produce. And that puts that whole theory into a risk. And that is just really just sort of classic market behavior.
Yeah.
Nothing more, nothing less.
So nothing to worry about.
I don't think
overly to worry about. All right, let's come back domestic. UK, what's your analysis of Rachel Reeves? We've mentioned it already. She keeps saying she's all about growth, but some of the policies that she's put in place have definitely scared the horses.
Yeah. If I was a teacher, I'd be giving her a mark of probably 3 out of 10, I think, on the job so far. I think it was very poorly managed. We can all see that. It's very easy for me to comment from the sidelines, but it's one thing to say it's a growth budget, but it's another thing to actually deliver a growth budget. And unfortunately, what we saw was talking down the economy going into that sort of phase in the build up to the autumn statement, and then delivering a budget that was anything but a growth budget. And in fact, is arguably more of an inflationary budget. And that's the concern, pinning your hopes onto a few very, very long-term projects like I know the Heathrow plans weren't announced at the budget, but that will be years out before it even starts to have an impact on the economy. So I think it's been a poor start that we've seen from Reeves and the government as a whole. I think they've struggled to find their feet and actually try to deliver.
Final and very unfair question: any top tips you can give us? Any real market opportunities that you think are worth a proper look at?
So, our view at the moment, I know Madhushri was just touching on a few areas such as sort of mid and small cap. We do like equities and we do like fixed income. And they're now behaving themselves and coexisting as we would want in portfolios, and think global.